Right, good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see you, although I can't see so many of you, but see your boxes. I can see Lucy Notes. There you go. My name's Claire Langhammer. I'm Director of the Institute of Historical Research, and this is the session on what we can and can't tell from the History Ref 2021 results. So if you think you're in for something else, that's what you're getting. This is the ref session. I want to say at the beginning that we are recording this session. I know there are a number of people who are going to be watching this on catch up. So just to let you know that we'll be capturing everything for posterity. Whether that has an impact on what you want to say, I don't know, but that's what we'll be doing because we want as many people as possible to be able to get access to this information. Our structure is that Margot is going to, who I'll introduce in a minute, is going to be talking us through the kind of key lessons of Ref 2021. We're going to leave time at the end for questions and hopefully a discussion around Ref. We'll be able to fold into that discussion any other sort of related topics that you might want to discuss, not least open access. But I'm going to now introduce Margot and hand over to Margot. So Professor Margot Finn works on modern British history, as many of you will know, particularly topics relating to British colonial and imperial history before 1914. She's also co-author of the three really significant and I think formative for the discipline reports by the RHS on equalities and inclusion across history. And she also has an active interest in open access and indeed in open scholarship. Margot has been on the last two refs and for her sins was the deputy chair of the history subpanel in Ref 2021. So Margot, I will now hand over to you and mute myself.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thanks for inviting me to this event. Just a couple of further framing comments, and then I've got a slide back, which I'll go through, and which we can also make publicly available with the recording. And then we'll move on to the discussion and any Q&A. So in terms of things I'm going to say, everything I will say about the ref and how it worked and how to think about it will be in accordance with ref rules. So I will only be giving you information about how ref works. It's in the public domain. And I'll be pointing you in my final slide toward the most sensible place to go to find out more information about ref. I have also, for my own departments, first Warwick and then UCL, done an REE and a ref submission. So I may occasionally say things that are informed by having been on the other side of the process, but I'll try and be very careful to say, well, as somebody who has put together ref and RE submissions, here's kind of how I interpreted the rules, but I'll try and be very clear, distinguishing that from ref and how it works and what's in the public domain. So there'll be no secret information coming out of this. But on the other hand, I hope that all of the information that we share, and Claire will be able to participate in that sharing because she's been part of the process too, is the official information. I think the worst thing about ref is that there's a huge amount of misinformation about it at all levels of universities. And there are asymmetries of information across the sector. And a part of the reason that Claire and I and Mark Jackson, the chair of the subpanel, who's unfortunately unable to be here, really wanted to do this session was it so that there was a recorded piece of stable information coming from a sane, experienced place in compliance with the ref information that everybody could access. So we're hoping that this event, particularly for those of you here and for those of you who watch it on catch up, will diminish the asymmetries of information that there are across the discipline of history. Okay, so I am now going to, famous last words, share my screen with the slides that we've prepared. And go into from the beginning. Great. So from Claire, I understand you can now see the slides. So we're going to focus on the results. But the results obviously are a way of also thinking about the process and what the results do and do not say about our discipline. The first thing that it's important to emphasize is that every research exercise, whether it's the RAE or the REF, changes how it operates somewhat in ways that mean you can never directly compare one research exercise to the one that comes after. I think it is nonetheless useful for those of you who are responsible for preparing your unit of assessment or a wider institutional REF submission. I think it's worth looking both at REF 2014 and at REF 2021, albeit paying much more attention to REF 2021 than REF 2014. So it's useful to have the broader context as well as the more specific one. The rules for REF 2027, 28, whichever one in theory it is, will again be different. But REF tends to evolve rather than to radically depart on the whole from one iteration to the next. So just a few comparisons here in terms of outputs, that is publications. A key difference between REF 2021 and REF 2014 was that all staff with significant responsibility for research had to be entered. Whereas REF 2014 is often referred to as a selective REF, and that meant that universities and their submitting units could select who they submitted. And certainly in history in REF 2014, there were some units or departments or faculties that only put in about half their staff. So that was very different than the current REF. This time, pretty much everyone went in. Secondly, in the previous RE and REF exercises, individual staff members were attached to their publications. And if you were a full-time, mature or not early career researcher, for example, you had to be attached to 4 outputs or 4 publications. That really was decoupled in the most recent REF exercise. Everyone who went in, unless they had exceptional circumstances, had to go in with 1 output, but that output, once it was in, wasn't attached to them in any particular way. And as you know, you could put in up to 5 outputs for a particular person. So the decoupling was a real difference from the previous time. And whereas last time, anyone who wasn't early career or didn't have special circumstances had to have 4 outputs attached to them, this time it was an average across the unit of 2.5. I think most people involved in the process felt that was a good thing rather than a bad thing. And particularly for us in history, which is a discipline with a very long gestational period, it really helped not to have the expectation that we would all have 4 worthy of submission outputs every REF cycle. So personally, I think that this is a good development, the 2.5 outputs for a full-time staff member. Impact, which was new to REF 2014, and in REF 2014 counted for less than in REF 2021, is now 25% of the overall profile compared to 20 in the previous REF. Previous REF, in addition to impact case studies, there was an impact template in which units of assessment explained how they approached impact. That aspect of the old impact template for the current REF was folded into the environment statement. So it was really part of the first part of the environment statement. So now all that is assessed under impact are impact case studies, at least 2 for every submitting unit of assessment or UOA, and quite a lot of impact case studies for larger faculties or departments. Finally, environment, which has now been shrunk down to only 15% of the marks that one gets for REF, and was much more closely specified in REF 2021 than was the case in REF 2014. REF 2014 kind of let departments riff in multiple directions. This time round, I think rightly, we were more dirigiste, and we'll come later on to the different four sections. One thing to bear in mind, and I'll make this point a couple of different times in this presentation, because it's particularly important for historians whose units, schools, faculties, whatever, combine history with other, particularly other non-humanities departments. It's quite common, for example, for history to be bundled together with politics. Well, politics is entered in main panel C, whereas history in REF is entered in main panel D. Main panel D was the only one of the units that gave greater weight to the people section in environment. So it was worth 30% for us, and for other units, for other non-panel D units of assessment, people was only worth 25%. The argument there, which I think again was a perfectly valid one, was whereas a physics department is going to rely very significantly on its infrastructure, in history, we don't actually rely nearly as much on our infrastructure as we rely on our people. Staffing really, really matters for us in history. So I'm going to talk a little bit first broadly about the working methods that we used throughout the assessment as a whole, and then I'll work us through outputs, impact, and environment, come back to a few conclusions, and then we open up for discussion. First thing I think to bear in mind is that items for review, both in particular outputs or publications, are allocated to panel members based on expertise. And for impact case studies, there are a number of usually non-academic impact experts drawn from the public sector, drawn from they can be people experienced in working with the BBC and other producers, people experienced in working with the heritage industry, for example, and they also assist in the expert assessment. The RAE is overwhelmingly about peer review, and that peer review includes both academics and non-academic experts, particularly in terms of impact. Submissions are read in what is here described as sufficient detail to ensure robust assessment. A lot of very detailed reading goes on in history. And Claire, if you could see her head, you would see her head nodding vigorously. We really, really, really don't rely on algorithms at any point. What we're relying on is reading the evidence. Outputs can be cross-referred to or jointly assessed with sub-panelists in other disciplines. So it's very, very common for things to be read instead of an historian by a classicist, if they're ancient history, for example. Something might be read either jointly with a theologian or by a theologian rather than an historian. And we also can refer things out of panel D, that's out of humanities, where that's appropriate. And later on in the presentation, you'll see some statistics. It's very common for outputs to be shifted from the history subpanel into a more appropriate subpanel to assess them, though the ultimate assessment will lie with the history panel. Very strict procedures were in place to manage and to declare conflicts of interest. I can say with robust confidence that the members of the history subpanel were very, very good about declaring where they had a conflict. Some of those conflicts were so minor that we were surprised but pleased that members had chosen to declare them, even though they often needed to be set aside because they were so minor. Having seen someone at a conference does not constitute a conflict of interest. But I think our panel members were really clean and honest about declaring anything they thought would be a conflict of interest. Once somebody was recognized as having a conflict of interest, we were very, very rigorous in recusing that person from either that unit of assessment or that person's work, for example. And everybody declared conflicts of interest with whole institutions where that was appropriate, for example, because a partner worked there or because they had recently worked there themselves. I recused myself from the University of Warwick, so technically I was out of the declaration period for that, just because lots of those people are my old friends. I didn't think it was appropriate, so I was assessing them. And obviously I was recused from UCL because I worked there and did that submission. We did pay significant attention to ensuring that there was comparability across panel D, that's the humanities panel, including classics, history of art, for example, English literature. But then panel D also engaged in comparability exercises with the other main panels. So there's a lot of time and effort spent in the REF process, the calibration exercises. Those operate both within the subpanels. So within the history subpanel, we compared our individual assessments of different types of outputs, for example, and if people were outliers, we did additional calibration. But then our history subpanel also compared how we were marking things to the other subpanels. And that's not just a process that happened at the beginning of the marking of outputs and of impact. It was continuous really throughout the process. So there are a lot of calibration exercises and ongoing review and moderation as sub-profiles begin to emerge. That process is not just confined to the UK academics who are the main panel members. International experts are also brought in to give an international perspective to those calibration and moderation processes. And you'll be able to see further details of those in the main panel D and sub-panel reports, which my final slide will refer you to. So what are the headlines from the subpanel 28, which is the history subpanel? 81 submissions received. That was 2 fewer than in REF 2014. The great majority of these were from England. There were 9 submissions from Scotland, 4 from Wales, and 2 from Northern Ireland. One institution, that was the London School of Economics, made 2 submissions. So they submitted 1 economic history submission and 1 international history submission. So those 2 disciplines, which are 2 separate departments at the LSE, had a different assessment along the same principles, obviously. History is unusual relative to many of the STEM subjects in having an extraordinary range in the size of UOAs, the size of submitting units. And that was true last time as well. The smallest unit submitting was 3.5 FTE. The largest was 172.75 FTE. That's a really big span. And I think that's something that most of us who deal with a discipline at discipline level take great pride in, is the fact that we have really, really excellent history being exercised and practiced in very small units, in small-ish units, in medium-sized units, in large-ish units, and in very large units. You can do first-rate history in a very wide array of institutional settings. And I think the REF results, when we look at them, will demonstrate that as well. That's much harder to do in the bench sciences because very often the kit that's required makes it harder to be excellent in smaller sizes. But in history, I think the REF has shown again and again that we can do that. More staff were submitted this time, 32% more, as you can see there, and that's simply a consequence of REF 2021, unlike REF 2014, not being a so-called selective exercise, in that everybody was meant to be put in. Over 5,000 outputs were submitted. As you can see, if you read the subpanel report, over 4,000, but under 5,000 were actually read. And that's simply because many submissions were put in as fallback positions if double weighting requests weren't honored. Over 99% of double weighting requests were honored, so we didn't need to read those reserve items for double weighting. 248 impact case studies were submitted, and I would certainly say for those of you who are involved in REF or involved in impact activities, all of those impact case studies are now in the public domain. They're an extraordinary data set. If you really want to see how history can make an impact on the world, the data is now available to you in those 248 impact case studies. So, other history headlines, general points. History is one of the largest subpanels in panel D. It is the largest in terms of reported grant income, for example. And within it, units of all sizes and all types scored highly. So whichever one of those different descriptors, whether you use red brick or plate glass or Russell group or million plus, all of those types of units were able to score highly and did score highly within this exercise. Excellence was found across all types of submissions. Almost all submissions had some element of 4-star, and many had lots of elements of 4-star, as we'll see when we turn to the results. So in history overall, combining outputs, impact, and environment, and using the weightings that those are accorded, 43% of submitted material was rated in the top world-leading, so-called world-leading 4-star, 37% at 3-star, 18% at 2-star, a mere 2% at 1-star, and technically 0% unclassified. These figures are all rounded up or rounded down, as you see in a moment in the next slides. There was submitted unclassified material, but it's at a tiny percentage. I think one of the things we can take away from this headline slide is that historians are actually not only very good at doing history, but very good at doing REF submissions. 43% and the absolute top quality profile is very impressive. And if you put the 4%, the 4-star and 3-star together, it's a really pretty impressive submission. So I think this headline speaks very well of the discipline, notwithstanding really trying times that we're working in. Outputs, where I'm going to start. Again, I think this signals really very good strength in terms of the quality of outputs, with over 40% ranking 4-star and nearly 40% ranking 3-star, and 20% at 2-star, which is again good publications, though not ranking as well as others. Very low percentages of unclassified and 1-star work going in. I think this suggests that those of us and those of you who are doing REF submissions, however difficult we find them to do, we're actually coming up with very good outcomes for our institutions. Now, the assessment process for outputs is absolutely done through reading the outputs. We absolutely do not assess based on where things are published. And REF is very clear about this. You are to read the content of the output, not the form and place. And I can honestly say, hand to heart, to the extent that humans are capable of doing that, I believe that that's what we do. It's what we're told to do. We're told, don't look at, is it in the American Historical Review? Is it in past and present? Read it and assess it based on that. And I think that's something that colleagues took very much to heart. It's not what press you publish with or what journal you publish with, it's what you publish meant to be important. In terms of the types of things that were submitted, journal articles, as you can see, were the predominant article. Authored books at 34%, bearing in mind that the majority of authored books are double weighted, submitted for double weighting and accepted for double weighting. So they actually loom larger than might be suggested there. Book chapters, again, a significant minority, but all output types, websites, scholarly editions, for example, all were proved capable of attaining 4-star grades. Double weighting, widely practiced, particularly with books, and overwhelmingly requests that were made by submitting units of assessment for double weighting were accepted. That's very consistent with the previous ref as well. Overlap, an issue to which we might want to return in the discussion or the Q&A, is a fiddly bit of the ref, but not a problematic bit, I would say. The ref guidelines, as you'll recall if you've read them, only allow you to score or award a score to the same material once. So if, for example, a double-weighted monograph of 6 chapters is submitted, 2 of those chapters previously occurred largely in the same form in journal articles, and both of those 2 journal articles are submitted. The material from the monograph that is those 2 journal articles, well, effectively those journal article chapters will be subtracted out. And what's assessed will be the remaining material, which did not count in the journal articles. And we can talk a little bit more about that if that description was not clear. I think what I would say, following on from 2 refs, is though this is fiddly, it's completely unproblematic. You can subtract out 2 or 3 chapters for most monographs in the manner I've just described, and it will have no impact on the fact that there's still enough material left to double weight. It sounds like a problem, but it proves to be much less of a one. Cross-referral, as I've already mentioned, or joint assessment by 2 different disciplinary perspectives, it's quite common. It's a minority of outputs are assessed this way, but it's a significant number. And this process, again, is largely unproblematic. The chairs and the deputy chairs have a good way of transferring in and transferring out, and we don't stop the allocation process until we're satisfied that a piece of work is being allocated by somebody who is able to assess it. Outputs, I think, in terms of the findings from our assessment, demonstrated really that there is fabulously high quality research across a staggering variety of subjects, time periods, methodologies. Historians are doing interdisciplinary work, discipline-based work, work in political and economic history, work in new emerging fields, and there's excellence really across the piece. Originality, rigor, and significance are the 3 criteria that every piece of work is assessed against. And we saw that both in established fields, fields that have been in the RAE and the REF since time immemorial, as well as in new fields we haven't really seen in the previous exercise. One finding that we do pick out in the subpanel report was that in some fields of study, where scholars in the field are publishing in multiple languages, possibly Spanish and Portuguese, or possibly Urdu. There was in some outputs, by no means all, but in some outputs that were purely Anglophone, the wider historiographies in languages other than English weren't being fully engaged with. And in terms of PhD supervision and production, that's something we think the discipline needs to attend to more, and ensuring that scholars publishing in new, more global fields in particular are engaging with a wider global historiography. Impact. Impact was worth 25% of the score for this most recent ref. And again, you can see some very high scores, 45.3% of the impact case studies were awarded a 4-star. That's really impressive, actually. Writing a 3-star impact case study is difficult enough. And again, if you put together the 3-star and the 4-star impact, that says something very impressive about what historians are doing to engage much broader audiences with our work. The quality of submitted impact case studies, again, compelling evidence of the impact of what we do. And it's really very wide-ranging. Lots of heritage sector work, but also work in policy, education, social justice, health and well-being, museums and archives, a whole range of ways in which historians are engaging. We did make the point in the final report, and I'll make it again here because it's blindingly obvious, that because we have quite a lot of very small units, for those very small units to have to submit 2 impact case studies was really exceptionally demanding for them. And as the next guidelines for the next REF are discussed and deliberated in institutions and in the discipline and in the sector, I definitely hope that there are strong voices making the case for smaller units being able to either submit collaboratively with other units in their institutions or to have a lower burden of impact case studies. I think that was something that was felt very strongly across our subpanel. Characteristics of strong case studies are, first of all, effectively demonstrating the link between the underpinning research produced in the submitting unit and the impact that is being claimed. You had to meet a certain threshold for your impact case study to count as impact. Second, I think clearly identifying who the beneficiaries of the research were and providing really robust evidence of that benefit. Technically, you're not required to have both qualitative and quantitative evidence. Obviously, it's easier to build a strong case for the reach and significance of your impact case study if you have both types of evidence. So for those of you who are planning impact case studies or helping your colleagues to plan impact case studies, thinking early on about collecting the evidence rather than waiting for the impact to have happened and then going back retrospectively for the evidence is, I think, wise counsel. Obviously, this time around, we had the ghastly impact of COVID, with quite a lot of people in the public sector being on furlough. And I think that's taught a lot of us to capture your evidence as you go along, rather than after you've done your impact activities. I think that the sources that were used that made for effective impact case studies didn't just demonstrate dissemination or public engagement, it gave evidence of tangible change or tangible benefit. And again, that really required some pre-planning. It's often the case, perhaps usually the case, that strong impact case studies involve relationships, and that takes time to build. So short-term impact is much harder to do than longer-term impact that relies upon longer-term relationships. All of that takes time and often is assisted by having money. Finally, environment. The headlines here, again, lots of good evidence that there are lots of good environments for history, regardless of institutional type and regardless of institutional size, with nearly 50% of the environment elements ranking at 4-star and a stonking 40.9% ranking at 3-star. So this, again, I think speaks well to history as a discipline. Evidence, again, and you can see this in the various ways that units have reported, being top 10%, top 1 or 3, top whatever. That type of excellence is evidence across units of all types and sizes. It's not just concentrated in predictable areas. The environment statement was divided into 4 parts: research and impact strategies, which includes the old impact template information; people, which included, for the first time, very specific information on equality, diversity, and inclusion. People was worth 30% for all panel D, humanities disciplines. Income and infrastructure was only 20%, in consequence, so it counted less. As I mentioned earlier, that's because in physics, at least in non-theoretical physics, it's difficult to do good physics without lots of infrastructure. But in history, infrastructure can weigh less heavily. And then finally, contributions to the discipline and collaborations is the final bit there. What are the conclusions that we can draw from the overall submissions? We generally think it indicates a healthy discipline. We may not feel that at the coalface, but the evidence that we produce in terms of our publications and our impact and our environment statement suggests there's some fantastic history going on in the UK. And I think that's something that our international assessors recognized again and again. There was a lot of resilience and a lot of creativity in the face of COVID. It was ghastly living through it, but I think history units managed the difficult economic circumstances and the difficult personal circumstances very well. An amazing range of submitting units and diversity of approaches to historical research and to impact. And we think that's a real strength of the field, a real strength of the discipline. And then finally, I think lots of challenges, including on the equality, diversity, and inclusion front. Lots of places where we could see promise, but couldn't yet see that that promise was bearing fruit, particularly with respect to EDI, but a huge amount to admire and be proud of in what we've done. If you are involved at any level in REF submissions or in REF assessments, you absolutely want to read both the panel D report, so that's the humanities report, and the history subpanel report for REF 2021. As I say, I'd advise you also going back and doing the same for REF 2014. And I've given you the link there to the REF 2021 information. All of the impact case study descriptors, those 5-page descriptors for all of the 248 impact case studies are up there on the web. There's a really good database of primary evidence for us as historians who use primary evidence to view. All of these slides we'll make publicly available to you afterwards as well. I'm now going to unshare my screen and hopefully see your faces back on the screen for those of you who are willing to share.
Thank you so much, Margot. That was incredibly clear and helpful. We're going to now open it up for questions. I'll start the ball rolling really with given that I guess a lot of people who will be watching this are people who are actually involved in their preparations for the next REF, whatever that looks like. You've touched on this a bit, but perhaps drawing on your experience of doing REF within institutions, what would you say your sort of top tips at this stage in the REF process would be? Margot, you're muted.
I'm an idiot. When will we learn? And here I am speaking from that personal perspective, not from a representation of REF perspective. My first and guiding principle, both of the times I've done REF submission, is any amount of time that my colleagues are spending doing REF or worrying about REF is time that they're not spending doing research or spending time with their family or being happy. So my approach to doing a REF submission is do not stress people out beyond what the institution is doing. You can't stop your institution from doing whatever they do. Don't have this as a punitive exercise, and don't stress people out with it. So something I've done both times and actually been allowed to do both times, and I know some institutions won't allow people to do this, but I've done it, I think, successfully. I've said to colleagues, you have a right, as you do, to know what the estimated scores of the outputs that you've given us to consider for submission to the REF are. And if you ask for those estimated scores, I will book an appointment with you and sit down and share them with you. I've also said, I really strongly advise you don't do that. And I suggest no one in our department does that. And in both cases, both at Warwick and at UCL, all colleagues just went along with that. And that meant no one in my department went up to anyone and said, oh yeah, I'm a 4-star scholar, blah, 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 based on estimates that a group of us, a well-meaning, intelligent, informed group of us came up with. Because I could estimate that Claire's output X is a 4-star, and it could come back as a 3-star. This is peer review. It's not a science. right? And again, I believe, that the subpanel acts in the best interests possible and tries to act without conflicts of interest. But peer review is not a science, as you know, if you submit to a journal, you'll get one person who thinks it walks on water and one person who actually thinks it needs a lot of revision. So I don't think that those estimated publication or output scores are a common coin that should be circulating in a department. I completely agree that people have a right and should be able to see them. But I think once they start circulating in that way, they create enormous stress. And they also tend to be outlandish. When I was hobbing at Warwick, everybody who submitted to a job application we had said, I have 4 4-star outputs. The total number of people who had 4 4-star outputs would have been astronomical if this was true. So I think there's a real misuse. Trying to run a process that is not about how can people in your department feel that I'm not as good as that person is, I think, a really, really important thing to do. And if you're given the space by your faculty or school, whatever, to do that, just take that out of there. Just take it out because it's completely meaningless. So that would be my first principle, try and de-stress. Second is read the guidance. The number of people I've talked to have said things like, oh no, we're not double weighting because that's going to make us look weak. You sort of think, that's going to make you look weak. Could you read the guidance where it says, double weighting, good thing for history? So try and read the material that is there. We have not lied to anyone in the subpanel report, either in 2014 or in 2021. It's written by people like the people who are on this Zoom, like the people who will watch this Zoom later on, who want the best for their discipline and are in the discipline. So try and take that. I know it's difficult to not feel that there's a conspiracy somewhere. There isn't actually a conspiracy. Yes, refs rules are difficult sometimes to work within. They are designed to be as applicable to an astrophysicist as they are to one of us. So necessarily they're clunky, but there is no conspiracy. So those would be my 2 guiding comments.
Thanks, Margot. That's really helpful. Lucy Noakes has her hand up. Lucy, while you have a go with that.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thanks, Gemma. Thanks both of you. Thanks, Margot. It's really, really helpful. And I, as I'm director of research at the moment and feeling fairly stressed as we had to submit our big ref analysis and strategy for the next 5-6 years yesterday. And I've just come out of a meeting with our research office and our pro VC research who wants to know what our impact case studies are going to be already. It's like, anyway, so I just want to say, actually, if Natalie had put in the comments that Reading, you'd found impact being quite hard as a small unit, and we found the same. And I think we're pretty much the same size, Natalie. And maybe we could talk at some point if you're doing the same kind of job as me, because we had some ideas about kind of buddying up with other departments to share ideas. But so I've got loads of things I could ask, but what I was going to actually try and limit myself to was thinking about ref reading. So probably in common with lots of you, everyone has to submit anything they've published to the repository each year, and that has to be graded by people within the department, which is problematic because then those grades get used for promotion. Yeah, so there's all kinds of issues there. But what I want to do over the next few weeks is actually get more members of my department kind of trained up so that they feel capable and confident in ref reading, because at the moment it's a burden that's kind of carried by relatively few people. And I wondered if you've got any tips for how you go about doing that. I know that there's material sitting there, in the original kind of ref, your kind of the criteria you used, but actually just approaching this, how did you do that? And how did you read this enormous body of work that you had to read? I mean, that's to both of you, really.
Yeah, so starting with the criteria is the first principle. So the criteria, obviously, for impact case studies are a little bit different than the criteria for outputs. They start with the appropriate criteria, and I think it's worthwhile assuming that those criteria, reach and significance or rigor, originality, significance, are unlikely to be radically transformed between now and the next ref. I hope I won't be proof wrong on that, but those are pretty stable. And I'm going to start with impact because that one is easier. Because the impact statements are all on the web, there is one institution which has 2 impact case studies, both of which were scored 4-star. So you just use the material on the web to find them, and you treat those as these are 2 of the ways that 4-star could look, right? And then you look at institutions where they only were scored at 3-star and 4-star, and you also read those. That's what I would be doing, and I'll be doing a similar exercise for my department in November. So you just go into the profiles and the scores and you pick ones like that. And then I tend to pick a couple that clearly got 2-star based on the profile of the unit. If you share those with colleagues while also giving them the criteria, and don't tell them what the scores were, your colleagues will overwhelmingly get that right. It's actually usually pretty obvious. Because it's about the depth of the evidence. It's about whether that evidence fits the claim being made, and it's whether a claim is being made, and that's actually easier than you would think. It's mainly a matter of familiarizing people with it. And because the impact case studies are so short, it's easier to do. And usually you do see this combination of statement, type of evidence, let's say qualitative, nice testimony, that the curator who said, oh, because of Margot's amazing work, we were able to do this. And then there is and 5,000 people then did that. So it's that mix. And it's not unlike what we would be doing in a journal article. It's not unlike what we're doing in a book. That's the other piece. So I think as historians, the way we work can readily lend itself to a good impact case study. Now, for journal articles and books, that can be a little bit more complicated. One of the things I've tended to do when I've done calibration exercises for people who are helping me assess outputs in my own department is to pick US-based or Canadian-based or Calcutta-based people's outputs, so that you're not asking people to assess the work of their mates, and you're not actually comparing people in the department to each other, which again, I think is not a great thing to do. And then you choose different types of outputs there, so that they get a range. And that, again, if you say rigor, originality, etc., and it's perfectly fine to have a discussion where one member of your reading team, who might be a specialist in the field, says, well, you don't see that originality, but I know it's original because of X. And then you can have a discussion in which you say, okay, what if we get an assessor who is broadly in this field, but doesn't have your incredibly granular knowledge? Will they pick up that originality? And that's where, because we're very early in the cycle, it can be quite useful when you're writing that journal article in the first place to include a statement that says, unlike previous historians, I've used this type of data, or I've deployed this new digital humanities methodology, so that those statements of originality and significance are explicit in the document. And then you are reducing the reliance on granular experts in the ref assessment process. And I don't think that's bad for our scholarship, for us to have to say, this is why what I do is significant. And coming at this from a gendered perspective of a woman who doesn't like to say that, shirty though I am, I don't think it's bad for us, actually, to say, this is original in the following ways. So that's kind of how I would pragmatically go about it. And I hope that is of some use in answering that question. And you can ask as many questions as you want because no one else has put a hand up yet.
I have Pratyush, good question there. And then there's also Mary Fraser has a question in the chat. So
should I start?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Margaret, for the presentation. I'm a historian based in Kathmandu, and I've edited a history journal for 27 years. I've never had a UK university-based academic submit anything related to Nepali history to the journal I edit. So I wonder if one of the outcomes of a ref exercise could be creating a incentive structure for historians based in UK universities for parts of the world where research on those regions of the world are not happening. So since you've just gone through a massive exercise which gives you a very clear overview of where research is being done. So is there a mechanism in the UK currently where such incentives can be created as an outcome of the ref exercise?
So that's a really interesting question. I think that institutional pressures, particularly coming from the top of institutions, often drive conservatism in ref submissions. I think there is, and some disciplines, economics, for example, have very clear hierarchies of journals. And in their promotions processes, younger people, for example, going for promotions will be, or early career people going for promotions will be expected to have published in certain key journals. The actual ref process, particularly for history, is not meant to instantiate or support that hierarchical vision of which article should be published in. So there is nothing at all in the ref process that means that a scholar can't publish in your journal or a journal outside the UK. And indeed, if you go into the submissions data, there are people publishing in multiple languages coming from multiple nations, and those are being submitted into ref. So that's really not a problem in terms of the ref process. I think where the problem comes in is that institutions are often very small c conservative. And they say, oh, wait a moment, that was published on a website, not in a peer-reviewed journal article. Should you be submitting that? But I think that's coming from the institution, not from the ref process itself. The ref process is very clear. It can be published anywhere in the public domain. It doesn't even have to be peer-reviewed to be submitted for ref. And that's where the internal review committees that Lucy was talking about before are so important. They have to be actually reading what's on the page, not reading what's in their head about where the page occurred. So I hope that helps to answer.
Yeah, could I just have a follow-up? I've never worked in a British university, but I've been, associated with the one in the University of London system for several years in the past. So I know for a fact that there is not a single UK-based academic doing any historical research on Nepal, nor I'm also almost 100% certain that not a single PhD student is being trained in any UK university on any subject related to history of Nepal. So I was actually not asking a question on the journal hierarchy per se, but I was asking sort of making the claim that there are areas of the world in which the UK is no longer training anybody historically on those parts of the world doing serious research of academic nature. So does the ref exercise create any incentive for any funding systems within the UK to actually cater to new research on neglected parts of the world?
No, unfortunately it doesn't, but RIF effectively looks at research that has happened. So it's an historical exercise in a sense. Instead of looking forward, it looks at what has happened in the past 7 years. It's possible, I mean, if there were no Nepalese output submissions, the other place to look at them is there's a very vibrant area studies panel. And it would surprise me if there were no material at all submitted to the area studies subpanel that had to do with society, culture, and history in Nepal. But it's possible, lots of historians are submitted under area studies rather than in history, just as many historians are submitted in business studies, for example, as opposed to in history or in art history. So you can look at the area studies submission and check your hypothesis that there is no research on Nepal being submitted in the UK. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I meant history research on Nepal. There are obviously people at SOAS and elsewhere who even some do research on Nepal and use at UCL as well. But I meant history research per se.
Okay, but remember that history research can be and is submitted to panels other than history. It is perfectly legitimate for standard historical research to be submitted for institutional reasons as area studies rather than history.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm going to just go to Mary Fraser's question in the chat. Mary, do unmute if you would like to ask this yourself. But if not, I will proceed to, so Margot, the question is...
I think Mary has just unmuted.
Yeah, go for it, Mary. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much. Yes, I just wondered overall, with the number of exercises that there've been, you know, this one 21 and the previous one 2014, whether there was a general feeling that the exercise was becoming fairer to most people. That's not to suggest that it wasn't considered fair in the first place, but just that the refinements and the changes that have been made have led most people to feel that it's now fair.
Good question, Margot.
Oh, I can't really speak for most people. It is definitely true that over time, the REF process has become more concerned both to enact and to demonstrate that it has enacted fairness. So, for example, the writing into the second part of the environment statements of equality, diversity, and inclusion, you know, requirements that you have to speak to that. And if you didn't speak to equality, diversity, and inclusion, you know, that detracted from your environment statement and thus in all likelihood detracted from its score. So that's one of the ways. I do think also that this time, relative to the previous time, we were much more self-conscious about unconscious bias training, about speaking to, let's remember the following types of unconscious and conscious bias at the beginning of every meeting, that is now hardwired into the process. Whether that means that people out there all think that the process is fairer, I can't really speak to that because I'm inside the process. I think it is important for all of us as cogs in the REF wheel to distinguish between the REF process on the one hand and how our individual institutions manage or mismanage the process. And quite a lot of the latter, I would say, is more problematic than the former.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Margot. Thanks, Mary. Natalie.
Hi, sorry, I was just looking to unmute myself. Thanks for this, Margot and Claire. It's really been very useful. And like Lucy, I'm also the research director for my quite small department. And we're also going through the same process of analysing our REF results. And like I said in the chat, I mean, we actually did, you know, we're fairly pleased with our outputs, but in terms of impact, it's something we really struggled with. In all honesty, we were disappointed with our results, and there's a bit of an inquest going across the university, but I won't bore people with that. But you know, I held an impact workshop last week. In fact, reading the case studies from the university where everything was 4-star, and you know, that was a really useful exercise. But I still felt a sense of despair at the end of the exercise, thinking, I don't know how I'm going to get 2 really good impact case studies with such a small group of people. And something we have been talking about is this idea of collaborative impact case studies, trying to spread the burden as well, because it's also just such a huge burden for individual researchers to bear in such small units. But and possibly this is my fault, and I'm not quite reading guidelines fully enough, but I still can't quite get my head around collaborative impact case studies, or what that might look like, and whether the REF rules might change around that, because obviously you have team impact case studies where everyone's been working on the same project, like the brilliant thing that York did with cathedrals. I can't remember the exact project title, but I'm still trying to understand whether, for example, you could have 3 or 4 people all working doing various sorts of educational impact, and whether that could, even if they were on quite disparate subjects, could that be submitted as something? Is it something that couldn't happen at last REF but might be able to happen in the next REF? I just wondered if you could give me some insight into that.
So on the one hand, the discussions are live at present. The REF itself is reviewing all the results, focus groups are happening, all of that. And then institutions will be consulted with as well. And some institutions will then consult with their staff. I tend to think is a good thing. So nothing is fixed at the moment, including the timing for the next REF. So a lot of things are up in the air. Certainly we made in our sub-panel report this argument about the really excessive burden on smaller units of being required to have 2. And I think we were not the only sub-panel report that made that statement. So I think there will be a discussion. I don't know how it will end up, but there will be discussion of reducing that burden in different ways. I think in the short term, what I would be doing if I were standing in your boots would be a couple of things. One is look at that York example and look at there's some other examples out there where 3 or 4 different units of assessment in the same university all entered different iterations of the same impact case study. And I would emphasize the different iterations, because your version submitted to the history subpanel is going to be read by the history subpanel in all likelihood. So you want to have a version that fits history. And it might be that you have an impact case study that you do together with the English department and, I don't know, media studies. And if they're all submitting to theirs, you're going to do bespoke versions. So think about that. Then think about the fact you need to have underpinning research coming from your unit. They will need underpinning research from their units as well. But the person who does the underpinning research, they could have died, they could have gone elsewhere, and they don't need to do all the impact work. You can hire people to do the impact work. You can have volunteers doing the impact work. You're undergraduates, technically. Now, whether you want your undergraduates doing your impact work is another question. But all of that burden doesn't have to fall on the PI or co-I on the ground or on the person who dreamed it up. The impact work can be done by others. And I think that's something that in some institutions, you know, the feeling is, okay, you had the grant, you did the research, you go out there and do the complete impact case study on your own, on Saturday mornings, in the rain. You know, that does not have to happen. And institutions need to think about supporting staff to do impact work, in part by hiring people to help them do impact work, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think actually that question of resource is really the biggest problem that we have. I don't see us ever being able to hire impact people at Reading, and there we have a problem. But perhaps I shouldn't be saying such critical things on
well,
something.
I mean, that is also where if you do have external grant, and the grant allows you to employ someone, that makes it easier to do an excellent impact case study. That's not to say it's requisite for an excellent impact case study, but it makes it easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is totally what we noted as well. So yes, thank you, Margot. Yeah.
Ed Armstrong.
Thank you. Yes, my question was just a follow-up one from something you were talking about earlier. Was I guess about like whether how to approach REF if you're working sort of across disciplines, and you're not necessarily sure at this stage, like which panel you might end up going to, do you think, like, how would you deal with that?
Yeah.
Would you have any advice?
So in terms of outputs, I wouldn't worry about that. So first of all, do not lose sleep about that. If, for example, you think that your work might be cross-referred to anthropology, I just made that up. Read the anthropology subpanel report too. Just get any information from that report as well. They will still be assessing on the same criteria. So it's just useful to know how they interpreted those criteria, but really don't worry about it in terms of outputs. They get sent hither, thither, and yon. There's a lot of this internal calibration. And ultimately, the unit that you are sort of lodged in knows that it will have interdisciplinary people on it. It will be capable of grappling with this. I think there's a lot of anxiety that goes into that. If you're in the system, actually it works pretty well. There's never been any evidence that interdisciplinary work has attracted lower scores than discipline-based work. There's been a lot of fear about that. There's not a single piece of evidence I know of that suggests that that's the case. So I really think of all the things to worry about in the world at the moment, I really would worry little about that.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Lucy.
Thanks, Claire. It's just really quick. It's just coming back to Natalie's point, really, about impact case studies. And it's really, really interesting, Margot, to hear that it doesn't have to be the person that's done the underpinning research, doesn't have to do the impact work. We were just talking about that this morning, but whether that was the case or not, because I've got a colleague with really great underpinning research that's being used by somebody else. But I think he's quite reluctant to be more involved in the various activities she's doing. So that's really helpful. But yeah, Natalie, I am doing my utmost to encourage colleagues as they apply for grants to be including, like, applying for an RA, something like that, or who can work with them, like specifically as part of their role, to do the kind of the impact activities. It's kind of high risk strategy because that does depend on people getting the grants, and we all know that can be quite hard to do. At the moment, the university is making good noises about providing resources for that with the new QR money that they've got, but that remains to be seen. But I'm also just thinking this is really, really helpful. I think this is a brilliant thing, being able to get some of us together to talk about these ideas, because one of the things, I really don't mind the ref in lots of ways. I don't mind the fact that it does mean that we all do have to do some research, and I've certainly worked in departments sort of back in in the olden days where people weren't really doing very much, and we're paid for it, so we should be doing something, and that's that's kind of fine. But what I hate about it is the way that it, like everything else in HE, it sets us up in competition with one another. So I think the more ways that we can share ideas and share resources like this, I think it's really, really valuable. I know that in the end it is a kind of a competition, the ref, but that doesn't mean we have to believe in it.
Yeah, totally agree. And some of the early RAEs, I think the one that would have been in the 90s, I think, Trinity and All Saints Leeds, which had been a former teaching college, for the first time went into an RAE, did really, really well in English and history, I think might have gone in together. And the money they got out of that RAE exercise, which their senior administration gave right back to them, was what led to the founding of the Journal of Victorian Studies, and so they'd never had any money for their research before, and they turned it into creating a wonderful new journal that continues to the present day. So, there is something in this for us. Just a couple of points, just to go back to the points you made. It is literally possible, and it does happen, that a department can build a case study based on the underpinning research of someone who is dead. Okay, so it really is the case that the impact work doesn't have to be done by the underpinning research person. Now, it is easier if that underpinning research person is alive and cooperative, but it's not actually essential. So that's one point to bear in mind. The other is you can find in the historic data And I could give you some steers without mentioning in any way scores, because I don't even remember scores. There are a couple of impact case studies that have come from 2 separate institutions because they were working on the same database or the same project. And that can be done perfectly successfully. When that happens, each institution writes its own impact case study and they play to their strength. So bear in mind, we can collaborate on impact successfully across institutions. And it's just another reminder that we are not each other's foes. You know, we want to collaborate with each other. We collaborate on co-edited volumes, on all sorts of things together. We can collaborate on impact.
Thank you. That's a really lovely message. Mary, can emeritus people be included?
So read the technical guidelines. If the work was produced in the department when they were employed, you can definitely use it. I forget what the then emeritus guidelines are beyond that. So I would just go into the regulations and double check that. I've repressed many of those finer points of the guidance, so I can't remember, but there is a statement somewhere in the guidance. I would just be a little bit careful in that we don't have the guidance for the next ref, so it's absolutely certain that people employed by you at the time will be, you know, that work will be submittable. Emeritus, I remember looking at that guideline for in a particular context. I don't remember what the answer was.
Now, I think Pratush's hand I've established is a historic hand. Is there anything else anybody would like to ask either Margot or just each other? I really love this idea of kind of cross-institution discussion. I think the more we do that, the better, really.